Welcome back, everybody. We're going to be looking today at how matter flows through ecosystems and how ecosystems are arranged from smallest to largest. There are different levels at which an ecosystem is organized, and that's a little bit about what we're going to look at today. So let's continue. Our objectives today, you're going to be able to, at the end of this video lecture, organize organisms into distinct groups based upon their interactions. Additionally, you're going to also be able to analyze matter cycles and how they impact specific organisms within an ecosystem. First, let's take a look at how biology or ecosystems are organized. And we're going to start off with the largest, which is an ecosystem. And that comprises all living and non-living things in an area. So this includes the organisms that live in it and the non-living things that have an impact upon those organisms. A community is a group of interacting populations, and a population is a group of the same species. So if you have a group of frogs as an example of the picture, that is an example of a population. A group of interacting populations, such as a group of frogs, a group of dragonflies, and a group of cranes interacting with each other, that is an example of a community. And then a bunch of these communities interacting makes up an ecosystem, which includes both the living and non-living components of the environment. So from smallest to largest, we go from population to community to ecosystem. Communities grow, and that's an important thing to understand. However, certain things can limit the ability for communities to grow. There are certain factors that limit whether or not communities can grow very large or stay relatively small, and that is what's known as a limiting factor. A limiting factor is a factor that restricts the growth of organisms. So for example, if there's a lack of water, for example, let's say in the desert, not very many large populations of organisms can live in the desert because water is limiting. It is a limiting resource. It's a limiting factor. It restricts the growth of organisms. Water is just one example. Things like nitrogen, carbon, all of the necessary components to build life, if one of those is missing, it's going to limit the amount at which the community can grow. So limiting factors restrict the growth of organisms, and some examples include things like water, carbon, nitrogen, even oxygen. Tolerance is the ability to survive when subjected to a biotic or abiotic factor. So things like temperature, precipitation can have an impact on how well an organism exists within an ecosystem. If we take a look at the chart here on the right, there is a specific range of temperatures at which this organism can grow. However, there is also an optimal range at which this plant can grow. The optimum range is right there in the middle, close to 26 to 28 degrees Celsius. The plant can still grow at other temperatures, but doesn't grow quite as well. And if you go to the extremes, that is less than 8 degrees Celsius, or greater than 38 degrees Celsius, you have no plant growth at all. What this shows is that organisms are adaptable. They are able to exist in environments that may not necessarily be optimal for their survival. However, the best chance of survival for an organism is to be within that optimal growth. They may suffer a little bit being outside of that optimal growth, but many times they can still grow. This ability to survive in harsher conditions is known as tolerance. One thing to keep in mind as we go through this is that matter flows in cycles, while energy only flows in one direction. Energy flows up the food chain, or up the food web, or up the pyramid that we've seen in other lectures. However, matter flows in cycles. Matter is continuously recycled through an ecosystem. It changes form, but is never lost. And we refer to these as biogeochemical cycles. Bio meaning life, geo referring to the earth, and chemical referring to chemicals. So these are cycles of chemicals that occur between things that are living and the earth. One example of which is the carbon cycle. Carbon is transferred many different ways. Carbon is released into the atmosphere when fossil fuels are burned. Carbon is released into the atmosphere when organisms exhale. We exhale carbon dioxide. Carbon is used in photosynthesis to produce carbohydrates. Plants take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Things that are eaten. Plants are eaten by animals. Other animals that contain carbon are eaten by other animals. So this carbon cycles. When we die, our carbon is released back into the earth. And that earth, the carbon that's within the earth, can come back up when fossil fuels are burned. So the cycle continues. This is a never-ending cycle that occurs because it is carbon and because carbon is found in a cycle. Now, at times it is a solid, and at other times it is a gas. Carbon dioxide is a gas. But this cycle is continuous. It's never-ending. Another example of a biogeochemical cycle is the water cycle. Things like evaporation, where water evaporates from snow or from streams and is put back into the atmosphere. Condensation occurs to form clouds. Clouds then precipitate and the rain falls back down to earth. When we ingest water, we utilize it in our bodies. When we don't need it, we expel the water. All right, and it goes back into the ground and goes back into the ecosystem, and the whole process starts again. So you can see that water is a cycle. It is a never-ending cycle, very similar to that of carbon. One other cycle I want to discuss is the nitrogen cycle. And the nitrogen cycle is very important to life as well. Without it, we certainly could not survive. 78% of our air is atmospheric nitrogen, but our bodies cannot use that. Luckily, there is the process of nitrification, which converts atmospheric nitrogen to usable nitrogen, such as nitrates and nitrites. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil take the nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into something that plants can use. Those plants then utilize that nitrogen to grow. Animals eat the nitrogen that's inside the plants. Other consumers eat the nitrogen that's inside the other animals. In order for us to get rid of the nitrogen, that occurs through our waste. That occurs through animals dying. The nitrogen goes back into the soil and the process continues. When we have too much nitrogen within the soil, process of denitrification converts that usable nitrogen into atmospheric nitrogen. These are how certain bacteria obtain their energy. The nitrogen is then released back into the atmosphere, and the cycle occurs over again. So this continual process is the nitrogen cycle, very similar to that of the carbon and the water cycle. So hopefully at the end of this lecture you understand how organisms are organized into distinct groups based upon their interactions, whether it be a population, a community, or an ecosystem. Additionally, you should be able to analyze matter cycles and how they impact organisms. For example, the carbon, nitrogen, and water cycles. Thank you for listening, and be sure to remember to take your quiz at the end of this. Bye now.